Chapter 1. In Kansas, spring usually falls on the day before summer. It had been such a day, and now at midnight I was sitting at my desk. Both hands of the clock were pointing to the ceiling, and to the limitless stars beyond. My wife and daughter had long been asleep. I had stayed up to write a few letters, but it was not a night for working. Although it was a bit chilly outside, the moon was bright, and a bird was singing a glad and plaintive song about the summer that was coming and all the summers that had passed and all that would be, adding here and there a bit of melody about all the good things that happened to birds and men without their knowing why. Both hands of the clock were pointing upward, and I was half asleep and half dreaming, remembering all the friends I had, most of them scattered to the four winds by now, and that best friend of all, Dr. Jack Odin. I wondered where he was and how he had fared since he disappeared into that dark cave in Texas. Suddenly I became aware of a flickering light above me. I looked up. I had thought that the lights were winking, but they were not. The room was lit by a reading lamp, and the ceiling was so shadowy that at first I could see nothing at all. Then I saw the light, or the ghost of a light, gleaming faintly upon, or through, the ceiling. It was the faintest yellow, neither a bullseye nor a splotch. Instead, it seemed to be a tiny whirlpool of movement, the faintest nebula in miniature with spirals of light swiftly circling a central core. For a second, I thought I would see through the roof, and the stars swarmed before me. It was as though I was at the vortex of a high whirlwind of dancing, shining specks of light. Then that sensation was gone, and there were two faint coiling spirals of yellow light upon the ceiling. The lights began to whisper. "We are Ato and Walden," they said. "Remember us?" I remembered them from the notes that I had pieced together to tell the story of my old friend, Dr. Jack Odin, and his adventure in the world of Opal. It seemed impolite to tell them that we had never met, so I listened. "Walden's work has succeeded," the whispering continued. "We have reduced time and space to nothing. You see us as light, or as we once put it, as flame-winged butterflies. But we are neither. We are Ato and Walden. By adding ourselves to another dimension, we are hardly recognizable to you. Actually, we are at our starting point billions of miles away. We are traveling through space toward you at the speed which would make the speed of light look like a glowworm crawling across the dark ground. And at the same time, we are there in your room. Do you understand?" I didn't, but I've learned that a man can live quite comfortably by merely keeping his mouth shut, so I kept still. My little daughter had been playing in the room before she had unwillingly gone to bed. She had left a red rubber ball upon my desk. "Look at the ball," the voices whispered. "We will give you an idea of this time-space in which we live." I looked. Suddenly, the little ball twitched, vanished, and reappeared. I gazed in wonder. It had been red. Now it was white. I picked it up and a white powder rubbed off on my fingertips. "See," the lights whispered. "We have turned it inside out." The whispering continued. "We are bringing you a gift. Our last gift, probably, because we are weary of your world and the affairs of men. Pygmies. Now stand back from your desk." It was such a command that I fairly leaped out of my chair and drew away from the desk. Still leaning upon it, I stared in wonder at the shadow which was forming itself upon the cleared space by the side of my typewriter. At first, it was merely a dark shape. Then it was a shadowy cube, growing denser all the time until it became a dim shape. The shape grew brighter. There was a tiny spitting sound, like two hot wires being touched together. There was a smell in the room, not unpleasant, but not pleasant either. A completely alien smell. A wave of cold air struck me, and passed by, leaving me shivering. Our furnace came on with a start. Then the lights were gone, and I was looking in wonder at a leaden box, about a foot square. It had a hinged lid, and around the middle of it the figure of a snake was excellently carved. It held its tail in its mouth, locking the box securely. Its eyes were two great moonstones that appeared to look up at me with half-blind amusement, winking at the wisdom they had forgotten and the fear that I was feeling. I touched the box and drew my hand away in pain. It was colder than cold, desolate, burning cold. It was 2 hours before the box became warm enough, or cool enough, to touch. Then, after several experiments, I got the snake's mouth open and the lid swung upward on chilled hinges. Within it was a manuscript. As soon as I looked at it, I recognized the handwriting of my old friend, Dr. Jack Odin. Well, it was just as before. It was more of a series of notes and jottings than a story. It took months to piece it together. Several pages were badly burned and spotted. It was hard work and slow work. And this is the tale that Jack Odin sent me from somewhere. End of chapter 1. Chapter 2. Jack Odin descended into the cavern, or what Keefe had called the hole, for less than 100 yards before his strong flashlight sent its lancing beam into a stone wall. At his feet was a crevice which went straight down, as though it had been measured by a giant square. He got to his knees and looked over. Playing his light around, he detected a few ledges, like narrow steps, far below. It was pitch dark down there, and not even his strong light could reach to the bottom. He tried tossing a few pebbles into it. Listening, he heard the faint rattle of their fall, but could not be sure whether they had landed on one of the ledges or had reached bottom. Looking around him, he found a weathered bit of limestone that thrust itself up like a small table. It did not look very substantial, but it was his only hope. Odin had crammed his ammunition, food, and canteen into a knapsack. Looping the rope through it and his rifle strap, he lowered them over until he felt the rope slacken as his gun and supplies rested upon the first ledge. Releasing one end of the rope, he carefully drew it back. Now he knotted the rope about the stone and let the two lengths of it trail down towards the ledge. He had kept his flashlight, which he thrust into his belt. One other thing, a little miner's cap and light, now came into use. It was warm down there, and as soon as the cap with its lighted lamp was on his head, sweat began to pour down his neck. Suddenly he remembered a scene he had witnessed one morning in West Virginia, so long ago that it should have been forgotten. His car had stalled in a tiny town one evening. He had slept in the only hotel, but he had got up before daybreak so he could start an early search for a mechanic. Looking up toward the hills, he had seen a silent procession of lights going upward to some unknown mine. There was something grotesque about those climbing lights. The identity of the men was lost, and this was a crawling thing up there on the hillside. For a moment, he felt himself feeling infinite pity for all the men everywhere who spent their days in the dark. Then he laughed. Better feel a bit sorry for Jack Odin, too. Getting ready to lower himself over a precipice, and not having the slightest idea when he would reach bottom, or whether there was any bottom at all. The blackness beat at the little light. A startled bat left its upside-down perch and fluttered against his face, clicking its teeth in warning. Well, he could stay here and think until doomsday, so with a shrug of his big shoulders, he got a firm grip on the doubled rope and slid over the edge. He went down and down until his shoulders ached. Once he got his feet down on an outcropping, but dared not brace himself there for fear of loosening his rope with its unsteady mooring above. Then at last he came to the ledge with only a few feet of his doubled rope to spare. After resting the little cap and lamp in a secure cranny, he lay flat on his stomach for a few minutes, gulping great draughts of air and trying to rub some feeling back into his aching shoulders. Then he got up and started looking around for some anchorage. Some 20 feet away, he found a little spur of rock. The second ledge was negotiated in the same fashion as the first. It was scarcely 4 feet in width. Leaning over it, with his powerful flashlight spraying a beam of light downward, he saw that there were no more ledges between him and the floor of the crevice below. Not even a single outcropping. The wall was smooth and glassy, as though at one time for ages and ages, water had flown down it and had left a glossy coating upon its face. Moreover, when he awkwardly dangled his rope into the abyss with one hand and kept his light upon it with the other, he found to his disappointment that not even a single length would reach to the dimly seen floor below. He sat there for a while, chewing at a bit of jerked beef, trying to get his strength back, racking his brains for a plan. But he could think of nothing except getting back to Opal. Then, at last, with a sigh and maybe a curse at the things that happened and maybe a bit of prayer, he began to tie a loop, lasso fashion, into his rope. Finding another spur of rock became a problem. This ledge was smooth. But in time he found one and drew his loop tightly about it. Rolling the knapsack up into a ball and tying it securely, he threw it over the brink. Listening, he heard it land and bounce 2 or 3 times. The gun was slung over his shoulder. The miner's cap and lamp went back on his head. He stuffed his pockets full of ammunition and slid over the edge. Once, he nearly lost his grip on the single strand and slid downward for a yard or two, with the rough coils taking the hide off his palms. But he held on, and at last he was dangling at the end of the rope like a plumb bob. Carefully, he tightened his grip with the right hand and let go with his left. His shoulder creaked, and fangs of pain struck at his wrist and elbow. But he hung on. Playing the flashlight below him, he saw that the floor of the crevice was still many yards away. It seemed to be of sand, but he was not sure. Limestone could be deceiving. Putting the light back in his belt, he began feeling along the wall. It was smooth. Finally, reaching down as far as he could, he found a little hole scarcely large enough for one hand. There was no time left to consider. Getting his fingers into it, he turned loose of the rope and dropped down. It felt as though his left shoulder was tearing loose, but he held his grip. Kicking about, he found a toehold in the wall, and finally another grip for his hand. In this way, Odin went down for nearly a dozen yards, but at last he could find neither a grip for his hands nor a rest for his feet. He did not care now. The pain in his shoulders was becoming unbearable. Taking one great gulp of air, he released his hold on the wall and thrust his body out into space. The little light in his cap went out. Odin fell through darkness. He fell into soft sand, doubling up as his feet touched it. Odin rolled over and over, losing both flashlight and gun as he tumbled. Then he came up against hard rock, with most of the wind knocked out of him, and lay there gasping, feeling about him with frantic hands for the light and the gun. The old terror of the dark swept over him as he clutched this way and that and found nothing. Then he got a grip on himself and laughed at his fears, remembering that he had matches in his pockets. The spurt of a match showed him that his miner's cap was not 5 feet away. He must have missed it by inches as he was clutching about in the dark. He lit it and soon found gun and flash. Pointing his light upward, he could faintly see the knotted end of his rope swinging back and forth there up against the precipice. It was his only link with the outside world, and it was far out of reach. He shrugged and played the light about the cavern into which he had ventured. The walls of the crevice into which he had fallen were never over 10 feet apart and in spots were less than 3. But the sandy bed sloped noticeably downward, so downward he went, only pausing occasionally to take a mouthful of water from his canteen or eat a bite or two. His watch had been broken in that last fall and he threw it away. The air grew hotter. So hot at last that Odin had to pause more often and rest upon the sand. But it was too hot, as though it had never known anything but this one temperature. Stumbling along, his nostrils and chest burning, and something thumping in his ears, he finally fell to his knees. Jack Odin lay there for a long time, but the floor of the cavern still led downward, so with nothing else left in his mind, he got to his knees and crawled on. That last determination saved him. A cool breath of air struck him in the face. He toiled downward and was soon in a wider cavern that was so cold he was shivering. He rested again and then went on. The cold grew worse. Odin came to a tunnel of ice. The faint smell of ammonia set him to coughing. It was nearly as uncomfortable here as the heat had been a few hours before. But he kept on. Finally, there was no ice left on the walls about him, and the air grew warmer. Soon the walls opened out until he could scarcely see them with his flashlight. Playing it upward, he could only get a faint reflection from the stalactites hundreds of feet away. At length Odin came to a vast room where his light could neither reach walls nor ceiling. But in the center of it was a tiny pool, rimmed by white sand, and a shell-like lip of limestone. He got to his knees and tested the water. It was clean, but old and old and old. Filling his canteen, he opened his knapsack and prepared a hearty meal. He was dog-tired, but before he slept he walked around the little pool. He had heard of fish being found in underground caverns, or even the fossils of things that had once been there. But here Odin found no sign of life, nothing except traces of the vast underground river that must have once swept through here long ago. It was a desolate feeling to stand there with his beam of light pushing the dark away, alone in a place which apparently had never known the beat of life before. And then Odin saw it. A footprint! A small footprint which must have been made by someone who wore moccasins or sandals. He recognized it at once. He had seen hundreds of those footprints. A Niebling had been there. How long before he did not know, but certainly Odin's theory had been right. The cavern led the way to Opal. Jack Odin was not sure how many times he ate and slept as he toiled his way downward. The long dead river had carved cunningly and beautifully upon the walls of the tunnel, and the dripping waters of centuries had fashioned pedestals, carvings, and statues that were beautiful indeed. Ordinarily, he would have been interested in these, for Jack Odin was a man who loved beautiful things. But now he had but one idea: to go on. Occasionally, he found more footprints, but always near the scattered pools. The dwarves must have kept against the walls and come out upon the sand only to quench their thirst. He wondered about that, and a possible answer came to him. They had been there without a light, feeling their way, almost, although he knew that they could see in the dark to a certain extent. He wondered at their courage. Here, with two lights, the staring darkness, and the silent empty spaces were making him shaky. The descent became sharper. At times he slid down long grades of limestone. Now and then he came to sharp drops where little waterfalls had once been. But there was usually sand below, and he was able to leap down without much harm, other than a jolt or two. But once he came to one of those drops that must have measured 100 feet. He found a few rocky steps where the little precipice met the wall and clambered down, but it was rough going, and he had to make a jump for it at the last. Picking himself up and dusting the sand from his clothes, he thought he saw a white gleam over against the wall. His light found a squat skeleton sitting there, grimacing at him. He touched the skull and it fell to powder. Here was one of the dwarves, a Niebling, but the bones did not belong to this age. The poor fellow must have lain there for centuries. Dr. Jack Odin was never able to get all of his medical training out of his mind. Examining the skeleton, he found that both legs had been broken. Apparently, the little man had been climbing up or down the precipice Odin had just negotiated, and had slipped and fallen. His leg shattered, and infection setting in, the Niebling had crawled against the wall to die. Odin could have imagined him doing the last task silently. They were akin to the animals that they loved, the Nieblings. They did not complain. Hours and hours later, as Odin toiled his way downward, he became aware of a growing stench in the stale air. Even this was welcome, for he was becoming obsessed with the idea that the cavern had not changed since the long ago river had died, and that nothing in it could change. It was an odor of rottenness. Where there was decay, life had also been. By the time he reached the next pool, the putrescence which hung on the stale air was almost sickening. There he made his second discovery. A saurian of some sort, with squat legs and long fanged mouth, had died there. Half decayed, it made a little phosphor glowing in the dark, and its long teeth flashed as he played a beam of light over it. Noisome as it was, the sight of it made his heart quicken, for here was one of the things of opal. It must have crawled up here from that silent sea. Then a feeling of gloom and dread swept over him. What had happened down there to make this thing leave its home and crawl here to die? Odin went on and on, the smell of the thing behind him slowly fading from the air. Then, as he rounded a corner, Odin blinked his eyes. Far ahead of him was a red glow. Taking a deep breath, he thought he smelled smoke. Or was it sulfur? He had never been able to get one grim possibility out of his mind. What if some of the fires and lava streams of inner earth should lie between him and the world of opal? He had gone too far to turn back, so Odin went on cautiously. As he neared the red glow, he saw that it was only a campfire dying down to coals. But from the darkness came such a clamoring of hisses, groans, and screeches that he could feel goose pimples popping out on his arms. His rifle held a clamp for his flash. Making gun and light ready, he advanced cautiously, still unable to determine what was happening except that one hell of a fight was going on. Then a coal burst into quick flame and he could see the struggle. A broad-shouldered man, stripped to the waist, was fighting with one of the saurians. He had closed its long mouth with a huge hand and was striking again and again at the white throat with a broad-bladed knife. The thing was screeching and clawing at the man's arm. Its razored tail was lashing forward, and the man was dodging it as he kept backing in a circle and thrusting the head upward and backwards. Both brute and man were streaming blood. The man made no sound other than an occasional savage grunt as his blade struck deep through the horny hide of the thing. The saurian became wilder with each blow. It was a long shot, but Jack Odin made it. Both man and reptile quickened into momentary stone as his light centered its beam upon them. Odin aimed and fired. The heavy bullet shattered the top of the saurian's head. Then Odin was running forward, calling out in the language of opal. The broad-shouldered man kicked the wriggling carcass of the thing out of the way and threw a few sticks upon the coals. They flamed up. The man sat down calmly, though still gasping for breath, and began to wipe the blade of his knife upon his thigh. He had regained some of his breath when Odin reached him. Rubbing a gashed forearm and smiling as though such a meeting were an everyday occurrence, he called out cheerfully, "Ho, Norse King! I knew you would come. Sooner or later you would be here, and we would go hunting together." The man was Gunnar, successor to Jul, and chief of the Neeblings. End of chapter 2. Chapter 3. Going to the pool, Gunnar began to wash his bleeding arms. "Yes, old Gunnar knew you'd be here, Jack Odin. For it was writ in times of silver long ago that a man would go to the gates of death and brave old Nidhugg the dragon there to find his maid." "And how is she, Gunnar? Where is she?" But the dwarf did not answer for a few minutes. He stared moodily into the coals, and then, feeling behind him in the dark, he found a bright shirt and struggled into it. "I was getting ready to take a bath when the thing came at me," he explained simply. "Gunnar, where is Maya?" Gunnar's big hand squeezed Odin's shoulder. "Steady, lad. I wish I knew. I wish I knew. But you are here now, and we will go hunting together. For you are my friend, and Maya is my friend. And I swore by my sword, the blood drinker, to her father I swore it, and to Jul, that I would look after her. But I failed. And is my word no stronger than a puff of wind? I have sworn a new oath. I will find her, even though we go farther than the graveyard of stars or beyond the gates of hell, maybe. I will find her." There was a sob in the squat man's throat, and Jack Odin could see by the light of the flickering coals that Gunnar had aged. His face was more seamed. The knots of muscle at each jaw were larger. His hair was gray-streaked and thinner, but those huge shoulders were huger still, and the big gnarled hands kept closing and unclosing as though they were grasping at a throat. "We will go together then," Odin said. "But tell me." "Then swear it by my blade." And Gunnar took the long sword and harness up from the sand where he had left it. "My people do not swear by the sword." Gunnar cursed. "The tongues of your people are like two-edged knives. I have had enough of them. But you are not like them, Odin. I said before that you were a throwback to the men of old time, when they went berserker together or followed the whale's path in their dragon-headed ships. Here, swear by the sword, my sword." And Jack Odin reached forward and touched the sword and swore that he would go with Gunnar even to the edge of the stars. "Now," Odin pleaded, "tell me what happened down there." "It's a long story, and not a pretty one either. Have you anything to eat?" Odin produced some bread and jerked beef. As they sat there with the coals winking red eyes at them, Gunnar told his tale between wolfish bites. "Grim Hagen planned well," so Gunnar began. "He planned well, and even yet I hope to kill him. That was an evil day when you and Maya decided to go to Outer Earth. An evil day. Some of Grim Hagen's men snared Maya with their thons. There was much fighting. We killed many, but many got away. I should have known from the black scowl with Grim Hagen wore these many months that he would not be stopped by one defeat. You will remember, Odin, how I told you of the little flying machines that we strapped on our backs in the old days and went sailing through the air. They were outlawed, but during the time that Grim Hagen held the tower he must have found the plans for the flying machine, or maybe even one of the machines. But when his men attacked us, each one had such a machine, and each man carried dozens of little glass eggs. When they threw them, they exploded and dissolved nearly everything for 20 feet around. Oh, we fought. We killed many, but it is hard to fight the hawk. One by one they blew up our ships. Then, carrying Maya and a few other prisoners with them, they flew out to sea like a flight of evil birds. No, not birds, for not even the hawk is evil. What was the word that you used for the leather-winged toothy things that lived in our forest? Dactyls, Jack Odin prompted. Yes, that's it, Gunnar said as he stared into the fire. Dactyls. I like that word. It has an evil, bloody ring to it. He stopped talking to take a huge bite of stale bread that nearly choked him. Then he continued his story. Meanwhile, in the city of the scientists, the same kind of fighting had been going on. We learned later that when Grim Hagen's men winged their way from the sea, his army had already retaken the tower. Ato and his soldiers were scattered. Half of them were dead. So, after scattering their explosive eggs across the city and killing the very old and the very young, Grim Hagen and his men took refuge in the tower and prepared to withstand our siege. They had learned much from their first defeat, and this time they held it well. As soon as we could patch up our ships, we came a-following and joined forces with Ato's soldiers. We assaulted the tower day after day, until the ground and the walks around it were black with our dried blood. But they held out. Not once did they try a counterattack. We should have guessed at what Grim Hagen was planning, but we didn't until one of the prisoners escaped. His name was Zal, and he was a friend of Maya's father. Poor fellow, he's dead now. But if we of Opal went in for monuments, we would build one a mile high for Zal. He told us that Grim Hagen was readying the old ship for flight into space. Also, he planned to leave the sea gates open. Zal saved us, or saved some of us, and part of Opal. Ato began training divers against the day when the tunnel would be flooded. We moved as many people as we could into the ledges high up on the walls of Opal. We got the great pumps ready to cope with the flooding. Also, Ato and I renewed our assault upon the tower, but they bested us. They had learned too many of the old secrets. Most of the young men of the Neeblings died there against the walls. That is how we keep our promises, Nor's king. But old Gunnar had a trick or two left. Remember the tale I read to you in the throne room of Balder? The first of the Bronze to enter the world of Opal were soldiers sent from some blasted planet in outer space to find a new home. They could fly their ship, but they knew nothing of the science and the magic that had gone into it. We of the Neeblings learned that, and we Neeblings were their historians for 1,000 years. Also, it was we who pieced together what little is known of their trip through space. And this is why. We of Opal have always kept up with the world above us. About 30 years ago, there were some popular stories in your land about Tani of Ekis, whose people came through the void in a spaceship. They traveled slow, and this is how they made the trip. They had discovered something which kept most of the crew under suspended animation for years upon years. That tale was not far from right, for the Bronze too had a capsule, red like a ruby, which made them sleep for a score of years. There was an antidote, a yellow liquid like curdled flames. 3 drops into the veins and the sleeper would awake. That is how they made the trip. Only a pilot, a co-pilot, a navigator, and a chief engineer were ever awake at one time. Their logbooks were brief, but we of the Neeblings have them. So, Gunnar continued, drawing a huge forearm across his moist blue eyes, I persuaded Zal to go back to the tower. I might as well have run him through, but he was our best and last hope. Wolden gave him a tiny cube, no larger than a ring case. In it was a crystal with a number of silver wires woven into it. But it was a good transmitter. Better than yours, Jack Odin. For a week, we heard from him daily. I say it was a week. We were working the clock around, and our little sun was misbehaving again. It was feverish week, not measuring day and night, for the sun would wink on and off as though it was getting ready to give up. For a week we heard from Zal. He gave the ruby capsule to Maya. She sleeps and will continue to sleep for 20 years, unless the antidote which looks like curdled yellow flame is given to her. I have it. Grimhagen may kill her or cast her adrift in space, but he cannot awaken her. That hound of hell can taunt her no more. She sleeps until Gunnar stands by her side. Then Zal sent us his last message. Maya was sleeping. He was barricaded in one of the rooms of the tower, and Grimhagen and his men were battering down the door. From what we heard in the next few minutes, I suppose that the door gave way and Zal died. Then Grimhagen's voice came to us, screaming in rage. He had all that he wanted. Even though our princess slept, he would take her into space with him, and she would awaken some day with the smoke of plundered worlds in her nostrils. Yes, she would awaken to be his slave, even as he had promised us that night in Maya's home when we fought. And I wish we had killed the beast then, but Zal was dead and there was no sense in listening to the man's ravings, so we turned off the radio. And this is the last we ever heard from Grimhagen. It was the next day when he opened the sea gates and trundled the ship out upon the floor of the sea. We had done all that we could do to be prepared, but it was not enough. The water came pouring in upon Opal. Half of the people died. Many had taken refuge in ships, and I doubt if a single ship survived that night. Yes, just as the water came flooding in, our little sun went out. We fought. The waters flooded both Vala and the scientist's city. Here it rose nearly to the top of the tower. There were only a few forests and meadows in the land that were not flooded. These were high up against the walls. As for the creatures of the deep, the reptiles and amphibians, most of them were dead. Many crawled into the ancient caves and fled upward. Most of them died. That is nearly all. We know now that Grimhagen and his ship, with all his prisoners and loot, took off from the bed of the sea with a flourish, which was just like Grimhagen. Meanwhile, Ato and his crews got the gates closed and started the pumps. Only a few men of the crew are alive today, for the tunnel was radioactive at the time. It was weeks before the pumps could force the water back into the Gulf. Most of our plants were lost. My men and I have been foraging in the world above for these, and have helped ourselves to your cattle when we could. The waters are back to their old level, but they left a soggy, ruined world behind them. There is a deal of work to be done before it will be like the world you knew. And our sun is of so little use we can scarcely dry out the sloughs. Meanwhile, Wolden and his men are working on another ship. Even a larger ship than the one which Grimhagen stole. They work day and night. Grimhagen took his choice of our treasures. He stole our princess. He killed millions. We are going after him, even if he drives us to the edge of space. And I am going because of a promise I made long ago, and because of the love that I have for Maya. And because of you, Jack Odin. The sword is forged now. It is white hot upon the anvil. The sparks leap out like stars as the hammer of the smith clangs down, and I will follow Grimhagen as far as a man can go, even a league beyond the outer shell of space, or a day's journey beyond the grave. So Gunnar's tale was ended, and the two sat there in silence, watching the coals wink out, and the feeling of the all-devouring dark coming back into the cavern. Then I will go with you, Jack Olden told Gunnar, to fight at your right side until we find my princess. And until Grimhagen is dead, Gunnar added, for he is a noisome leaven that will pollute all of space that he touches. The last coal went back to ashes. Odin turned on his light, and Gunnar blinked in pain at the sudden glare. Then they went onward and downward, past columns of limestone that were already old when the world was young. End of chapter 3. Chapter 4. Soon the floor of the cavern was slippery beneath their feet. "The waters came up to here," Gunnar said. "Now take a deep breath, Norse King, for the air gets worse before it gets better." He was right. The stench of dead things came crawling upward to meet them. Soon the floor was littered with the things from Opal's sea that had crept here to die. Huge, fanged saurians, lizards, toads, and snakes. The cave was strewn with their carcasses, some half decayed, others dying into hardened shells, others already reduced to stinking bones and sinew. Gunnar kicked several out of the way as he made a trail for Odin to follow. The short man did not tire. He went on and on at his steady shuffling gait, which left them miles behind, while Odin's pack and rifle grew heavier and heavier. But Gunnar did not stop, so Jack gritted his teeth and stumbled after him, while the dead things grinned at them from the dark. At last they saw a reddish light ahead. Gunnar paused and pointed with a gnarled forefinger. "Opal ahead. All that's left of it." They came out upon a narrow ledge high up in the cliff wall. Odin filled his lungs with clean air and gasped at the changes. Above them the little sun had dwindled to a red coal. The crimson-flicked clouds of opal steamed and boiled beneath it. The sluggish sea was black now, and the long, low waves were cresting with bloody foam. Something was choking in his throat. All the wealth of Juneland had spilled over into the night. Gone. All gone. And for what reason? It was not enough to say that time and gravity worked against the things of men's hands. It was not enough to say that all good things must pass. No, here was old Loki, the mischief maker, at work. The one who destroyed for no reason at all. Who ran through space like quicksilver and laughed as blossoms and leaves, towers and trees, the old and the young, fell before his senseless jests. Tears came to Odin's eyes as he looked out there at the ruins and remembered the splendor that had been. As he thought of all who died there, his hands were begging for the feel of Grimhagen's throat. Darkling, he stood there on that narrow ledge and thought how strange he and Gunnar must seem, like two trolls peering out of Hell's Gate. As though fanned by a tiny wind, the red coal of a sun flared up. Out there, far away, its red beams flashed upon the topmost turrets of the tower. They bathed it in reddish light, and it loomed halfway out of the slate-black sea like something left alone in a ruined world. An emblem of man's pride and his love for beautiful things. It stood there bravely and held back the night. There were tears in Gunnar's eyes also. Nearly 2 heads shorter than Odin, he stood beside him and clutched the taller man's forearm with a huge gnarled hand. "Over there," he said, pointing in a direction opposite from the tower, "is where I was raised. Ah, it was good in those days, Odin, very good. We of the Neeblings do not care for cities, but our farms and pastures were so arranged that there were several houses close together. And what fun the boys had hunting and fishing.
Then I would straggle home for supper, and my mother, who wasn't old then, would be at the back door with a laugh and a joke to see that her Gunnar had come home whole, and to make him wash his hands properly. And the supper table, Odin! You ought to have seen it. It groaned. There was no end to the food in those days. And after supper, the young'uns of the neighborhood would play outside until dark. One of our games was like one of yours. Some lad shut his eyes and counted while all of us hid. And then, after counting was done, he came hunting us. And toward the last he would sing out for those who were still hiding. Bee, bee, bumblebee, all's out and free. It was a great game, and then the night would fall and we would hurry home. One had no trouble sleeping in those days.
Gunnar paused to sigh a great sigh.
But it didn't work out. No one got in free. The homes, the pastures, the players, most of them are gone. And time took a heavy price. And only Gunnar is left to toss the last coin upon the counter. Well, I am ready to pay, so long as I get my hands on Grim Hagen.
Jack Odin gave him a playful punch on the shoulder, for Gunnar's thoughts seemed to be growing more dismal by the minute.
Well, little man, it was all a bright dream that went too fast. And are we to stay here on this ledge till doomsday while you try to respin the broken threads of the past?
So Gunnar's thoughts came back to the present, and his big shoulders heaved when he laughed.
Ha ha! Spoken like a Norse king, Odin. I must be getting old. Well, there's a way from here to the sea. If we were cliff swallows, we could make it easily, but being men, we'd better trudge.
He led the way along the ledge, which did not appear to have much of a descent until they came to a place where a rocky slide had taken trail and all into the sea. The avalanche that had made it must have been from a granddaddy of avalanches, for there was a steep slope of rocks and rubble from here to the water below. There, the stones had spilled out in all directions, and the waves moiled over and about them for several hundred yards. Far out, the rocks had piled up into a little seawall, with gaps here and there where the breakers foamed through.
We go down there now, Gunnar instructed, but don't start anything rolling. The stones are loose and we might end up in the water with 100 feet of granite over us for a tombstone.
Gunnar led the way. Crawling backwards like a crab, he felt his way down the precarious slope. Odin followed. Once his foot slipped and he sent a shower of stones down upon the dwarf. Gunnar caught them like a juggler and held them in place so comically that Jack Odin laughed for the first time since he had started on this journey.
And could you do better? Gunnar grumbled. Maybe I let you go first and we all go tumbling into the sea.
Oh, Gunnar, you did fine.
But you reminded me of a cartoon back home where the cat's in the kitchen and has upset some pots and pans and is trying to catch them before they fall and make a clatter. And is this a time to talk about cats? A cat's place is in the woods. Tell me about dogs, maybe, but I have no time for cats. Besides, if you would throw that gun away, you wouldn't be so clumsy. It's no good.
No, I was here once without a rifle, and I needed it badly. One bullet between Grim Hagen's eyes and none of this would have happened.
Gunnar retorted, I doubt if you could have changed one thread of the spinners.
But didn't I save you back there in the tunnel with this same rifle? Jack Odin answered.
And nearly deafened me too. Oh well, I probably would have killed the thing anyway.
Odin shrugged. Gunnar's philosophy couldn't be shaken. But the dwarf was serious about the rifle.
One shot would bring the rocks down upon us, Odin. Throw the thing away. It's no good.
Not until I find a better weapon. Jack Odin shook his head. At last they struggled through to the water's edge. It could not be called a beach, or even a landing, for the rocks came down at a 60-degree angle.
I have a boat over here, Gunnar said, and led the way.
Going parallel to the water was nearly as hard as coming down to it. Then Gunnar, who was by now a score of yards ahead, stopped and held up his hand. When Odin came up, he whispered,
We have a visitor.
Peering behind a huge rock, Odin saw a tiny motorboat moored in a little inlet that was barely large enough to fit in. But the boat, curious as it was in Opal, was not the attraction. A great sea serpent had coiled up in it and was taking a nap. The thing was nearly a foot thick.
Though it was coiled closely, its tail hung over into the water. Its head looked very much like the head of an enlarged moccasin, except there were long barbels about its mouth. And just below the throat were two limbs that were a bit like forearms, but were made up of long spikes joined by pulsing white skin. Gunnar reached back of his shoulder and drew his huge broadsword from its scabbard. Then, with sword upraised, he advanced cautiously towards the sleeping snake. A rock must have grated beneath his feet, for suddenly the snake awoke and its ugly head rose nearly 10 feet into the air. It looked down upon the advancing dwarf with a hungry look, and its long red tongue flicked in and out. Then with a devilish hiss it swept towards him, nearly capsizing the boat. Gunnar's sword went halfway through its thick scaly neck, but with a leap it was upon him, its forelimbs stretched out fan-wise, flogging and clawing. The head opened. Long fangs gleamed as it struck. Gunnar ducked and dodged, and striking fangs missed. The head flashed over Gunnar's shoulder. The weight of it sent him to his knees, and his broadsword buried itself in the snake again. Blood spouted, but it seemed alive and vicious as ever. Jack Odin had unslung his rifle as Gunnar went forward. Now he knelt and took aim at the swaying head that was rising above the dwarf. The sound of the shot was deafening. Its backbone drilled just beneath the skull, the snake dropped upon Gunnar, burying him beneath its writhing folds. Then Gunnar was loosed, and rushing to the boat. Above them, the cliff was groaning as though it were tired of hanging there. "Hurry, Norse King, hurry! The rocks tremble!" The snake's writhing tail still lay athwart the boat. Gunnar swung his sword and severed it. It slid into the water, and something that was mostly triangular teeth and mouth hit the water and seized it. Then it was gone, leaving a fading trail of froth and blood. The boat was half full of water. Gunnar climbed in, and Odin came right behind him. Gunnar straggled with the controls. The boat sputtered, moved, and then stopped. Odin was staring at the cliff above them. A huge layer of stone was cracking and leaning outward. The boat came to life. Gunnar swung it crazily through the rock-strewn water. Looking back, Jack Odin watched the cliff coming down. Slowly, as though in a dream, the cracks grew larger, and then with a roar of pain the rocks parted and one huge section of the wall leaned outward, tore itself loose, and came at them like a waterfall of rumbling stones. The rocks fell just a few feet short of the fleeing, sputtering boat. The huge wave that followed the settling of thousands of tons of stone into the water swiftly picked them up and hurled them through one of the gaps in the seawall. Long after, while Odin was bailing water from the boat and Gunnar was fiddling with the motor that had conked out again, the dwarf looked back at the cliff. It was a shadowy now. Dust was still rising as it shook loose an occasional crumbling ledge. Norse King, we fight again," the squat man laughed. "You saved Gunnar's life once more, and you almost killed him too." He paused to wipe sweat from his dripping face. Odin grinned back at him. Then, without another word, he took up the expensive rifle and let it slip overboard. The ammunition that had cost him so much trouble and pain as he lugged it all the way to Opal followed afterward. He watched the copper shells as they gleamed like a school of minnows and plunged out of sight. "There, Gunnar. I have nothing left to fight with but my hands." "Good riddance to that thing," Gunnar smiled. "I will make you a blade that will slice through an anvil." The motor coughed, sputtered, and began to purr. The boat churned a wide arc in the water as Gunnar turned it and headed toward the tower, which now loomed far ahead like a beacon. End of chapter 4. Chapter 5. As the boat sped over the water, leaving a churning wake behind it, Jack Odin remembered that first sea voyage he had made on the seas of Opal. It was June time then, and Maya had been with him. Perhaps they had thought that June would last forever. Perhaps they had thought that all of life would go by at 5 miles per hour, remembering that slow, wonderful trip, almost like a voyage in a dream. He sighed as he held on to the skipping boat. They were now going well over 60. Gunnar seemed to sense his thoughts. "Wolden has ordered speed and more speed, my friend," he called over the roar of the motor. "The governors are all gone from the old machines. The smiths are turning out newer and faster ones all the time. Sometimes I think even the hands of the clock are going faster."
Odin muttered a curse. What he had loved about this world was its leisure. What he had hated about his own world above was its constantly increasing speed. Like a squirrel caught in a cage, his world had gone faster and faster until reality had vanished into a mad blur of turning wheels and running feet. Oh well, he thought, a man is like a pup. Contented enough until life takes him by the scruff of the neck and shakes him up and proves to him that things change and a pup's world changes and he had better accustom himself to the new standards or be shaken up again. So they sped on through the low waves while the tower loomed nearer and taller before them. Gunnar was guiding with one hand while he talked into a little square box of gleaming metal. He turned his head and the boat careened into a trough that set it to shaking. "I have contacted Woden and Ato," he called cheerfully. "They are meeting us at the dock. Not the old dock. It's still underwater. The new one's farther up the street." As they neared Orthgard, Gunnar slowed the boat. Looking down into the murky water, Jack Odin could detect now and then the faintly traced shadow of a roof or a tower. Once as he looked down at a finely carved weather vane, a huge fangfish rolled between him and his view. A white belly gleamed through the water, and a serrated mouth opened wide. Its jaws bent out of proportion by the reflection of the water. It reminded Odin of the old story of the monster of chaos, rushing with gaping mouth to swallow the works of men. Then they were at the dock, which was scarcely a dock at all, but a place where the waters ended halfway up the sloping streets of the city. One thing had not changed. To the last, the people of Opal refused to take part in any governmental excitement. A car was there, a driver. Wolden was there looking much thinner and grayer. Beside him was his son Ato, inches taller and perhaps a bit thicker in the shoulders and a bit thinner in the waist. These were all. He had nearly broken his neck half a dozen times to get there, but Jack Odin was glad that the old idea had survived. Being reared so near to Washington, he had been puzzled for years over his country's mile-long processions and the spectacle of thousands rushing to watch a parade for some visiting celebrity or some current politician who would be forgotten before the next snow. He and Wolden shook hands. Odin was surprised at the change in him. When last seen, Odin had been a man just leaving the prime of life. Too much of a brain, perhaps, a bit too curious and a bit too fearful of the affairs of the world. But now the hand was weak, the face was thinner and grayer, although even nobler than it had been. But the eyes were sad and pained, as though they had seen too much and had dreamed dreams beyond the comprehension of his fellows. Somehow, Odin found himself remembering a lecture about Addison, who probably knew as much as anyone about the hearts of men, but upon being made second high man in his government could only stand tongue-struck in the presence of Parliament. Then there was Ato. The months had changed him too. He stood tall and lean, and there was a deep line running from each cheekbone down his face. He looked older, but his eyes were piercing now, while his father's were somber. Strife and hard work had sweated all the fat from his bones. He seemed much stronger than when Odin had first met him. But here was something more than strength. Ato had developed into a first-class fighting man. Wolden could never have been a fighter. There was something both terrifying and sad in the comparison. Ato looked like a man who could calmly send 100,000 to their deaths for one objective, while Wolden would have theorized and rationalized until the objective was lost. The old comparison between the impulsive executive and the liberal arts man who had learned that there are only one or two positive decisions available in all the world of thinking. But each in his own way was glad to see Odin and welcomed him back to the ruins of Opal. Then, just before the reunion was over, the clouds grew grayer and it began to rain. As they got into the little car, Wolden told Odin that they would have to circle the bay before going to the tower on a ferry, since the lower stories were still underwater. The city had once been beautiful with trees. Now they stood like giant skeletons, drowned by the seawater. Here and there, a few limbs struggled to put out their leaves. The rain was cold, colder than Odin had ever felt in Opal before. He shivered, but there was something more than the cold dankness of the air to make him shiver. Then they came to the ferry, and the ferryman was so old and bent that Odin looked twice at him to make sure he wasn't one-eyed. He wasn't. So the ferry creaked its way out to the tower, to an improvised landing just below the 6-story windows. They climbed through the windows into a huge room that seemed to be carved of fairy foam, and behind them the rain grew heavier and the thunder rolled in the distance and the lightning flashed like witch-fires across the jaded sky. 3 days had passed since Gunnar and Odin had returned to Opal. Dr. Jack Odin stretched out on a huge bed and felt the strength of his ultraviolet light upon the ceiling, pouring into his shoulders. In the next room, Gunnar was bathing and complaining about the seawater. Drinking water in Opal was now at a premium. Odin had been in the dumps. Now he was feeling better, although memory of the sodden ruins that he had seen in the last 3 days would never leave him. "And are you howling, my strong little man?" he called out cheerfully. "In Korea I once bathed in a mud puddle and enjoyed the bath." Gunnar's first few words were unprintable. "There was a river close to my house where the water ran silver once over the tops of the ford. And there Gunnar used to bathe. This is slop, Norse King. Nothing but slop." Odin laughed again. "You're getting old, Gunnar. Did anyone ever guarantee that ford would be for you always?" Gunnar, dripping water and with a towel wrapped around his middle, came dashing into the room. He stood there, his arms and shoulders flexed. "And does Gunnar look too old to fight?" he asked. Odin blinked. Gunnar's muscular development had always amazed him. The short man stood an inch less than 5 feet. His chest and shoulders must have measured more than that. His muscles writhed like iron snakes as he moved. His biceps and forearms were those of a smith, which indeed Gunnar had been, for Gunnar had been many things. The huge torso slanted down to a narrow waist and hips. Then his short legs propped him up like carved things of oak. Gunnar had once killed a bull with one blow of his fist. He had once snapped a man's back across those bulging, stubby thighs. Gunnar disappeared in search of fresh clothing. Odin lay there, thinking of all the things he had seen since returning to Opal. Although the water level was still high up on the tower, the lower floors had been made watertight and had been pumped dry. On his first trip to the tower, Odin had little chance to survey the rooms. Now he knew something of what Opal had lost. Curtains, paintings, rugs, statues, the finest furniture. All these had been ruined or damaged by the flood. Each room of the tower had been a work of art. Both bronze and Neeblings had contributed to it, back in the days when they were working shoulder to shoulder. In spite of his thoughts for Maya, he could not help thinking that the bronze had brought this on themselves. When they tried to put the Neeblings in second place, that was when the bell had sounded. Even so, why had this splendor been reduced to ruin? Oh, there were jewels that could be salvaged, and statues. But the tower was a work of art from top to bottom. The finest lace, china as thin as paper, paintings, these were gone. One might as well salvage Mona Lisa's eyes and swear they were the original. Higher up, where the water had not reached, the machines had been stored along with other treasures. But Opal's best had been waterlogged. And the trip that Odin had made with Wolden into the tunnel, that was the most heartbreaking of all. The bronze and the Neeblings had saved the treasures from the warring civilizations of the world above. The statues could be preserved. Some of the machines might possibly be restored. But the paintings, the art, and the books, all gone. Wolden especially mourned a Navajo sand painting, which he compared to Goya. Not a trace was left of it. Wolden had taken him into the tunnel, just as he had once before. It was dripping now, and the sound of the pumps throbbed through the ruins like the struggling heart of a wounded thing. Their little car moved slowly down the old tracks. Occasionally it had to stop, where some disintegrating pile of treasures had spilled out. One sack of diamonds had broken. Wolden stopped and kicked the stones away. An ancient ford, with its back seat piled high with rotting and sprouting stacks of prize-winning oat seed, was both heartbreaking and ludicrous. The Brons and the Neeblings had been the true antiquarians of the world, and they had taken centuries to gather their collection. A dinosaur skeleton stared at them. The savage carved prow of a galleon leaned against the gaping whale's jaw. A model of the first atomic pile supported a score of leaning spears, but the feathers and artwork on those spears were now stains and shreds. An English flag, delicately embroidered, drooped beside the dripping tatters of the Confederacy. A Roman eagle was lifted high beside the crudely beautiful banner of the Choctaws, on which Odin could barely make out the 3 arrows and the unstrung bow. Chinese vases, thin as eggshells, most of them broken, lay in a tumbled pile beside ancient cradles and spinning wheels. A Neanderthal skull was staring hungrily at a 12-foot skeleton of a giant bird, and a restoration of a tiny little Equus was looking up like an inquisitive mouse at a huge, ruined painting by Rosa Bonheur. Thousands upon thousands of relics of the world above, some taken from the jetsam of the sea and others taken by exploring parties from Opal during those long glad years when the inner world was as comfortable as Eden and almost as happy. Gems by the millions, gold and silver coins, trappings, inlaid with diamonds, furs, silks, bone instruments and ivory carvings. A Stradivarius was warping apart, and a Gutenberg was swollen to twice its size, its moldy pages curling away from the parent book. The books had fared worse. Great stacks of leather-covered libraries were turning into moldy, starchy mounds. Papyrus and lambskin scrolls were falling apart. Once, when they stopped for Walden to thrust some moldy folds of Hindu thread of gold weaving from their path, Odin stopped and picked up the cover of a book. It was soggy and faded, but he could make out the title. Poems by a Bostonian. So they had gone on, but slower now than on their first journey into the tunnel which led to the floor of the gulf. An odor of dankness and decay hung over everything. The air was cold and damp, and everywhere were the footprints and handprints of Death, who had spared this galley for so long, but who had come back with his flashing scythe to claim his own. The stinking carcass of a hammer-head shark, washed in by the flood, lay sprawled across the sodden sarcophagus of an Egyptian princess. And a gloomy sickness fell upon Jack Odin there in the tunnel, as he thought of all the splendor that had died there, and the ages and ages of sweat and blood that had gone into these treasures. 1,000 treasures were trying to whisper their stories to him, but the dripping water was drowning them out. Thousands of men, some slaves and some kings, were trying to tell him what the jewels and books and swords and cradles had meant to them, but the drip, drip, drip of the water choked the echoes of their voices. The darkness that was ever crowding in seemed to be filled with the shadows of beautiful women in their fine laces, with flashing jewels about their throats and pendants brushing their half-covered breasts. They were trying to smell out of the dank, but a cold fog was creeping from the walls of the tunnel, settling above the shadows and driving them back, farther and farther, into all-pervading nothingness. Seeing his misery, Gunnar had clenched Odin's arm. "These were things of the past, Norse King, and the things of the past belong to the old dragon. Let us not complain if he has taken them at last. We have things to do, and we cannot do them if we are sick at heart. Did I tell you that 4 of my children died in the flood?" The voice of the broad-shouldered dwarf sounded husky and far away. "No, Gunnar, you never told me indeed, my old friend. I am sorry. Very sorry, and am ashamed that I sit here mourning the past and forgetting your troubles." "Yes, they died. My Frida and the other 3 are coming here, and we will eat at the same table again, and I will tell them that their grandsire and their great-grandsires were men among men, and that Gunnar himself has often sat high at the councils. Then we will go out to find grim Hagen, and Frida and the 3 will go back to rebuild the farm. For that is the way of things,
and as long as there are strong ones left to rebuild, Loki cannot altogether destroy us.
The car moved slowly forward. The dismal fog grew heavier, until at last they came to the place where the old ship had stood. Now there was a new ship taking form within its huge cradles. Lights were everywhere. The red lights of the forge, the blue lights of the welding torches, the white light of the workbenches. The yellow lights that surrounded the high scaffolds went up and up to the top of the hourglass figure.
"This is our second," Walden explained. "Our first was much smaller. We had been working on a smaller model long before Grimhagen got ambitious. Some of our scientists have already gone into space. We are in touch with them. They went quietly and noiselessly. There was no need for all the destruction and havoc that Grimhagen worked. But this model is larger even than the old ship, and all the improvements that we once dreamed of are here. You see, Odin," Walden continued, "the old ship was ours for centuries. We of Orthgard have exploring minds. We went over the ship thousands of times. We knew where every bolt and pin was located. We improved it. In the beginning, when it brought our ancestors here, it must have been comparatively slow. But during the past 40 years, we learned much from your scientists about space. Einstein was the only thinker in a century gone mad from bickering. About 10 years ago, we perfected what I call the fourth drive. It would take days to explain it, but it can throw a ship into trans-Einsteinian space. We had equipped the old ship with the new invention. Our experimental drive was so equipped, and this newer, larger one will also have the fourth drive. But we have made a few improvements at the last."
It was all too deep for Odin, and there was so much to see that he did not ask any questions. Workers and smiths were everywhere. They crawled over the scaffolding like ants. They hammered and pounded at the framework. They were bent over furnaces and anvils. The presses and shapers were pounding away. Never before had Jack Odin seen so much activity in Opal.
"We are wrecking our building for this ship," Walden warned. "Given time, my experiments would have made worlds and space unnecessary. But it has been voted that we go after Maya and punish Grimhagen. Even though we drive to the edge of space, so be it. We are now building in weeks what would have once taken years to do. Those on our experimental ship who have already gone out into space, they have helped us immensely. Daily they report the results of their tests to us. The good points, the bad ones, the improvements. Oh, when this is finished, it will be a greater ship than we ever dreamed of. I did dream of such a ship when I was young. Now I find I do not want it. Even so, I will go out among the stars. Walden was never a coward, nor his fathers before him."
"So be it," Odin answered, and he leaned his head back and looked high up at the scaffolding where the welders' torches flashed like stars. "So be it, Walden, but I would have gone anyway." And Gunnar spoke.
"I would have gone beside you. My sword is thirsty."
High up on the hourglass shape, a bit of magnesium caught fire and burned brilliantly for a second, its sparks flashing out and down. A worker, who was no more than a shadow, smothered the flame. The sparks drifted downward like lost suns, seeking a course that they could find no more. They sparked and burned, then they winked out, and there was nothing left upon the scaffolding but lancing flames and scurrying shadows. All about them now, the smiths were beating out old chadies on the ancient anvils and the newer clashing machines. End of chapter 5.